Welcome everyone. Today I'm joined by Swagata. If you and I haven't met, my name's Samantha and I'm a full-time private tutor and I'm also a trainer, so I train adults and other educators. And today is all about independently preparing your children for 11 plus exams. Swagata is a parent and she has successfully prepared her eldest daughter and she's now preparing her son. And I thought that her perspective would be really interesting for all of us because both of her children are very, very different. Now, we are talking about the Buckinghamshire exams, the transfer tests. However, this isn't sort of training on the Buckinghamshire tests as such. This is about general 11 plus preparations. Okay, so for anyone who has just joined us, you'll see in the chat, you can ask any questions, please do, as we're going along, and we will do our best to address them. So Swagata, thank you so much for joining us. Thanks for giving up your time.
Thanks very much for having me, Sam, and inviting me on.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Now, the first thing I'm going to ask you, this is a question that loads of parents ask me, is when do you think the right time is to get started with 11 plus preparation?
Yeah, that's a really good question and quite a hard one, I think, to answer. But I guess the way that we did it is when you have sort of parents' evening meetings, etc., you'd speak to the child's teacher from about year 4 and find out kind of how your child's doing, which will give you a really good gauge as to what their sort of potential is. Now, like you mentioned, I've got a daughter and a son, and they are very different. So my daughter's naturally, like she's a complete bookworm, an avid reader, and she loves English. So her strengths were in English, and I think because she was the first one, I didn't actually appreciate how early we should have potentially started with her. So with my daughter, we started in year 5. But because we'd gone through the process with her, I had a much better understanding of, when we should prepare our children. And so we've actually started earlier in year 4 with my son.
Okay, so year 4, I think, is quite a common place to start. And actually, you've just given us a really good tip, and that is to speak to teachers in parents' evening, and then you can get an idea of how where the strengths and weaknesses lie. Now, if you are starting preparing in year 4, how do you make sure that by the time they get to the exams, that child hasn't burnt out, or that they're not anxious or overwhelmed? Because obviously it's a lot. You've got schoolwork, plus you've got this independent work. How do you make sure that doesn't happen?
Yep, again, another really good question. So for me, I think it has to be a dual kind of goal for yourself and your child to want to actually pass the pass the test and go to grammar school, etc. So it's about talking to the child and making them understand why they need to do a little bit extra on top of their schoolwork, and I would say that, start off with reading, etc. Start off with like really short sessions. So you might just do 20 minutes a day with them during the week if they haven't got too much, especially in year 4, the homework isn't too bad. So you could potentially do sort of 20 minutes to half an hour Monday to Friday if you want to, or if you're a working parent and you don't have that time, perhaps do 20 to 30 minutes over the weekend, or in two sessions. So something in the morning, something in the afternoon, just to kind of get them used to the fact that, okay, they've done their school homework and that's separate, and then this is something in addition to kind of help them achieve that joint goal that you're both both working towards.
And how can you tell whether your child's actually going to, I mean, obviously you can't tell what's going to happen in the end, what the result's going to be, but are there any things that you look out for as a parent to give you indications that actually my child's got a really good chance of getting through these exams?
I think it is the way that they kind of respond to these types of tasks that you're asking them to do. So, if for example, they do love reading and you ask them to read a bit more and they're happy to do that, then that's obviously a good gauge. If they are sort of, feeling tired, etc., and they feel exhausted, or they really don't want to do it and they continuously, show that kind of reaction, then I would question it. But in terms of, understanding their potential, it's a case of just talking to them, finding out how they're finding, like the extra pieces of work that you're giving them, which will give you a good understanding, but also talking to the teachers at parents' evening, because they will also give you a really good gauge as to where your child is at and where they think they might go.
Okay.
Does that answer the question? I kind of gave.
Yeah, definitely it does. Now, when you're talking about these activities that you're setting your child, what kind of tasks do you tend to start with? And when do you start building up the intensity? When do you start making it more difficult? How do you build up the stamina as well as the skills?
Yeah, so I normally do it, just trying to think through both scenarios. I will base it a lot on how much homework they've got for the week. So I don't have a structured plan, for example, say, right, okay, this week you're doing this week you're doing that. It is very much based on week by week, how much homework have they got? If they've got additional projects and things that they're having to submit, then of course I'm not going to ask them to do anything extra. But so with my daughter, because she was naturally a good reader, loved reading books, then I started more with maths because that's actually where her confidence lacked. So we would do sort of short kind of like let's books and things like that, and like 10-minute, there's a lot of different sort of 10-minute maths tasks and things. So we would start with that during the week, and then come sort of year 5, we would start to build that up a bit more. So rather than just 20-30 minutes, we'd go for 45 minutes, for example. And then I would say closer to April of the year that they're going to be sitting the test, that's when you kind of ramp it up a bit more. And that's when I started testing them on time. So up until then, it would be, other than the 10-minute maths test, etc., it would be very much in their, doing the work in their own leisure. But come April, I would start to put a timer on the amount of time it would take them to complete tasks. And then in the summer, it would be a case of, right, let's sit down and actually do these practice papers and see how you cope with that.
Okay, and do you have any specific resources or books that you have found useful for these Buckinghamshire exams? For anyone who is not looking at those 11 plus exams, these are with the GL exam board, so that's the style we're looking at. Obviously you've got other exam boards like CEM, and also some schools they just set their own style of work. So these tips are useful for everybody, but Swagata, are there any books that specifically helped you for these exams?
So yeah, I've got to say what's helping me the most at the moment, especially with my son, is the fact that because he's not a natural reader, he won't naturally just go up and pick up a book in, spare time or free time. We've actually started off with this book here. I don't know if you can see that in the
Comprehension Ninja.
Yeah, it's Comprehension Ninja, and it's by Andrew Jennings, which is brilliant to get them really interested in comprehension. And then we've got these mini comprehension inference books as well. So they're really short versions of comprehension that just get them.
Which book is that?
So this is 11 plus exams, it's called. Okay. And sorry, I can sort of write down the names for you later and send them across. But there's like 3 books of mini comprehension inference books, books 1 to 3, and that's been really good, especially for my son, to sit there and read. And it would only be about sort of 12 or 15 lines, and then answering some questions where they have to infer a bit more and show that side of skill, because he's very much like, oh, well, I've read it and the answer's not there and that's it, job done. He won't answer it. Whereas now we're sort of building up those inference skills. So that, I'm sorry, I did have one more, which is more around sort of non-verbal reasoning, and they've also got a verbal reasoning one, but this is by GL Assessment themselves. And it's great just for practicing the sort of types of questions that come up. Now, the experience that I've had and what I've heard as well, sort of from my daughter and then like the year after, is that they do continuously introduce new types of questions. So you can't always prepare for all the different, the various questions that they ask, but you can certainly give it a good go with practice papers and books.
Yeah, I really agree with that. In my experience, because I train students for lots of different schools, so Tiffin, the Berkshire exams, the Buckinghamshire exams, what I have found in my experience is that sometimes they'll say, oh, there's no verbal reasoning paper, for example, but actually they slip in some of those verbal reasoning style questions in the English paper. So right. Regardless, you do need the good thing about verbal reasoning and non-verbal reasoning is it gives you a much better grasp of English or of maths. So actually they're very complementary with each other. Now, you showed us some of the English books and you mentioned the non-verbal reasoning. For your daughter who struggled with maths, were there any specific books or resources that helped you for these exams there?
Oh gosh, yeah, there were actually. Again, it was GL assessment. There was maths books and the Let's books. I don't have them to hand because it's been sort of a couple of years now with her. But yeah, definitely like the Let's books. And there was a GL assessment book. But again, I can sort of provide you with the details so that you can sort of post that out
Yeah,
to
that would be
everyone with the
great. Thank
recording.
you. Yeah, that would be really good. And slightly, this might be a bit of a tricky question. I know that you went through the 11 plus, process yourself, didn't you? And Swagata and I are kind of childhood friends, and neither of our parents are English. Now, if I know there are lots of parents where English is not their first language, they have not been through the process. What advice can you give them for them to support their children when they themselves might not be so confident with these subjects?
Yeah, that's a really good one. So yeah, you're absolutely right. Although back in the days it was actually 12 plus for me, so it really shows my age. But yeah, so you know, my parents were very much like, I just have to pass the exam, and they would just buy, you know, lots of practice papers and things. I think it's definitely worth you know, the GL assessment ones, especially if it is from Buckinghamshire, but certainly go to the board that are, you know, writing the papers for your children. And if you go up on their website, they will give you a lot of supportive documentation, resources, and just really kind of home in on the understanding of why they're sort of asking these types of questions, which should then hopefully help you to, you know, support your child a little bit better. Sorry, there was one other resource that I forgot to mention, which is the flashcards as well. There's lots of different companies that that sell these flashcards, which is all around the vocabulary that your children need to learn. And I've got to say, like for a 10-year-old, they do expect a lot, but these flashcards kind of, they state the actual word, they state the antonym and the synonym. And so that's a really good way of building up your child's understanding of the various different vocabulary that's expected of them.
Yeah, that's something that certainly helps. And something I would add to that, I actually do this with my younger students as well as my GCSE students, and we see quite quick results, which is get them in the habit of reading every day. Now, if your child is a reluctant reader, if they really don't want to read, don't put pressure on them to read 11 plus books. Just get them reading anything that they want, as long as they are reading. The first thing to develop is the habit. Once you've developed that habit, as they're reading, they'll come across words that perhaps they're not used to, that they don't know the meaning of. And what I get my students to do is to keep a vocabulary journal. And it's a similar concept to those flashcards, because what they then do is they look up the meaning, they find out the synonyms, they find out some antonyms, and then they try using it in as many sentences as they can. And that really helps them embed this. So whether English is your first language or not, and you're supporting if you're supporting your children, that reading is still a very good task for them, because ultimately if they have to attend an interview, for example, your children won't be able to be coached for that. You can't prepare for absolutely everything. So they have to develop those independent skills. So that's really, really useful. A couple of things from some parents. Pooja, thank you for your recommendation. She said that she found the CGP and Let's book also very helpful when they prepared for the Bucks exams. And Ijay's asking, Swagata, I know you showed me this last time actually, do you have any suggestions with the flashcards?
Yeah, sorry, I think it's a company called Flashcards. Sorry, I had them on me and I don't have them right now. But again, I can send it across to you. But those are the ones that we use that state the sort of, you know, the meaning of the word, the antonyms, the synonyms, etc. And actually what we do is, again, you know, very much with my son, because he's not a natural reader, he won't pick up a book, he will read comics, etc. And we are really trying to get him into that sort of book reading. But on the way to school, we'll literally just, you know, give him a card, he'll sort of read it, etc. And then we'll just start going through the meaning and just do it in a fun way while you're kind of waiting for school to open. Obviously, that's harder, much, you know, now with lockdown, etc. But that's something that we were doing. So it's outside of a sort of environment where you're having to sit down in a chair and at a desk, etc. You're out and about and you're literally just talking about words and putting them into interesting sentences.
Yeah. Yeah, using those words as much as possible is important. Ijay, Swagata will give me the name of these resources, including the flashcards. And when I publish this video on my website, I'll make sure I put those on there. I think you're probably in my Facebook group, so I'll definitely post it in there as well. And one thing you mentioned about the flashcards for English. Is there anything similar for maths? Now, maths is not my subject at all. I teach English, verbal reasoning. Is there anything, like whether it's times tables, whether it's quick non-verbal reasoning questions, have you used anything like that for maths?
We haven't used flashcards. I'm just trying to think, actually. The kids were playing. It's, again, I will get you the name of it, but it's like Scrabble, but it's with numbers instead. And they're playing it with, my 7-year-old, and that's a really good way of getting them strong in numbers. So I'd say the first thing is make sure that your child is up to speed with their 12 times table, so they know it like the back of their hand, because that definitely helps with any type of maths questions. But it really was just the sort of like 10-minute maths tests that helped. Helped my kids. Now, my son doesn't need as much help in math. He's just a natural with numbers. He loves numbers and he will do that all day long. So I haven't really focused on the maths with him, but certainly for my daughter, those 10-minute maths tests were really good.
And we've got a question on creative writing. I'm just going to ask Muntaha, I'm going to ask you a question. When you're talking about giving some ideas on creative writing, do you mean how do you motivate someone for creative writing, or do you mean how do you help develop creative writing skills? So I'll just give you a moment to let us know exactly what you're asking. But Swagata, on the creative writing side, especially with your son, where English is not his strength, how are you developing those skills? How are you encouraging those skills?
So what we'll do as a family, especially now with lockdown, we're going out on lots of family walks. So a lot of it is we're out and about, and we'll literally just start, and it will mainly be their dad, who loves English as well. So he'll start a sentence, and then he'll, pick on one of them to then make up the next sentence. And it then becomes this whole story that no one knows where it's going to go, and we will take it in turns. And that works really well for my son. So it's not actual writing, but it's that whole creative process and getting those ideas in his head, because he's not naturally one to be creative. He is much more about facts and about numbers. So we do find that that's really helpful. And what I've bought this week, I haven't started it with him yet, but because he isn't a natural in sort of talking about his feelings and communicating, etc., I've actually bought him a journal in which he can write in to talk, to say how he's feeling, because he's like the middle child. It's very much that middle child syndrome where he does get a bit left out. So I'm trying to think of ways that we can kind of encourage him writing about, about things, but also about getting in touch with his feelings. So those are sort of like the two areas that I would focus on.
I think a journal's good. You're talking about developing creative writing. With creative writing, you need to make sure you're practicing lots of different types. So it could be a newspaper article, it could be a formal letter, an informal letter, it could be a description of a story. You could be given a first line prompt, and based on that, you have to develop a story. So what I would always start with is developing descriptive writing skills, because regardless of what style you're going to write in, you're going to have to describe something. So start with descriptive writing skills, and when you're developing those, give your child a picture. They can even look out in the garden and start developing the skill of zooming in on very small details. And a really good way to do this is by saying, imagine I can't see that picture, you have got to describe it to me so that I can visualize it. And if you can visualize the colors, the smells, all that sensory language, then you know they've done a good job. Also, you want to look at persuasive writing. So that's going to come in useful if they're asked to write, let's say, a letter. So ask them to persuade you of something. So next time they ask you for something and you're saying no, so it could be, can I stay up a bit later? Ask them to persuade you, ask them to write you a letter, ask them to write you a speech, so that they can really start understanding what has an impact. EJ's asked a really good question again, is how do I help my son improve his speed? Just before this, Swagata and I were having a chat, and we actually mentioned that, didn't we? We were talking about how speed is so important. So for both your daughter and your son, how are you developing, or how did you develop speed?
So I To be fair, I didn't focus on speed from from the beginning of year 5 for my daughter. I kind of did it halfway through. The problem that I had with my daughter is actually she would skim read because she's an avid book reader. She wouldn't read every single word. She would skim read, and I actually needed her to slow down because she wasn't answering the questions correctly. So I didn't have so much of an issue with speed with her, but I've certainly got it with the challenge with my son. So what I've said to myself is actually until sort of February, March time, I'm not going to concentrate on speed because I need him to feel confident in, in the fact that he can do this. I need him to feel confident that he can, answer the questions and he's got the skills. So at the moment, I'm literally just focusing on the fact that he's able to read the question and answer it. And what I've said to myself is from kind of around March time, I will then start to put in like the speed element. So I'll put a timer in front of him because he's all about facts. And if he can see those numbers going down, knowing how long he's got left, that will really help him visualize, okay, I've only got 2 minutes left, but I've maybe got, 8 more questions to go. So he'll naturally know that he needs to speed up. And so I plan to do it sort of, in bite-sized stages, really. So do it at 10-minute marks initially, so he gets a really good feeling for how long 10 minutes is.
Yeah, the timer is really good, actually. I'll show you the one that I use. I use this timer, I think I bought it on Amazon. And what I can do here is I can set the timer and then it has a countdown and then it beeps when that time is over. And I use that to develop speed as well. And a really good thing to do is at the beginning, you want to build confidence. Confidence unlocks everything. If a child doesn't feel confident, they are going to perform. They're not going to perform very well. So at first, if I think, okay, I think this task is going to take this child probably about 5 minutes, I will give them about 6 minutes and then I'll be like, wow, you finished early, that's amazing. And then immediately they've got this confidence. Then what I do is I give them another task. Now, let's say this next task, it should take them about 4 minutes. I will actually cut that short. I'll put them under pressure. So now I'll give them 3 minutes to do it. But I'll say to them, don't worry, if you need a bit more time, you've got it. So they don't panic. And because their confidence is boosted, they're up for the challenge. So I would always use a timer. I think that's a really good tip. I use that with all of my students. And slowly just increase that pressure, but do it in a way that's going to build their confidence, not make them feel like, oh God, I can't do this, or that where they're stressed out. Because even if they're brilliant, that will affect their performance, in my experience anyway. Would you agree with that, Swagata? Is that the kind of thing that you do with your children?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Like I said, I didn't need to do it so much for my daughter, obviously, other than sort of practice papers, etc. But certainly with my son, it is all about building that confidence so they feel that they can actually do it. Until they get to that stage, they're quite reluctant, I think, and yeah, they just don't feel that they're able to answer the questions, etc. So the moment you can boost their confidence, that's when you'll just see progress.
Yeah, I agree. And guys, we've got about 5 minutes. So if you've got any questions, anything else you would like to add, already such brilliant questions, please do ask in the chat and we can squeeze those in. But Swagata, I also wanted to ask you that, as you're building up this stamina, as you're building up momentum, how do you know what to balance? So these guys, the students need exam practice, don't they? But at the same time, they need to develop skills. So do you start straight away with a combination of these books and these flashcards and exam papers, or do exam papers come later? How do you think it best works?
To be honest, I'm quite relaxed in all of this, and the way that I do it is I set them as mini goals. So, the overall goal is to make them feel confident, feel that they can pass the 11 plus. Okay, so what do we have to do in that? And we've got these 4, various areas. So we've got maths, we've got English, verbal reasoning, and non-verbal reasoning. Initially, I will start with, getting them to answer questions in each type, so that they know, so that I can get a gauge for what they're weaker in and what they need more practice in. So with my son, I know that it's the English and comprehension questions, so I've focused on comprehension. And that's all I've focused on. I haven't done all 4 in one go, because I just think that might be too much for him at this stage. And then just sort of as the months go on, you know, we then sort of move it forwards and progress it to nonverbal reasoning, etc. But because he's naturally good at maths and he enjoys the nonverbal reasoning side, I'm not so worried about that. I'm more worried about his speed, I guess, which I'll come on to in a few months' time.
And we've got 2 questions that we're going to try and squeeze in. Again, brilliant questions. The first one is, do you have any tips on working with 3D nonverbal reasoning style questions? For example, are there any YouTube videos or particular books or flashcards that you can recommend? In fact, I'll ask that to you first. Do you have anything specifically for that you can recommend?
Sorry, that's 3D or
3D nonverbal reasoning.
3D nonverbal reasoning.
Do you mean the spatial type ones where, do you know what I mean? When I've seen some of these where they have almost like a plan and they have to figure out what kind of shape it's going to make. Pooja, is that the type you're referring to when you're talking about 3D nonverbal reasoning? I'll just wait for Pooja to message me back.
I'm just trying to think. Is it this? Is this the type of thing?
Yeah, that's what I had in mind.
Yeah.
Pooja, is that the type of question you're talking about? Yes, nets. Yeah.
Yeah.
The net type questions.
Yes. And sorry, what was the question? Do I have any?
Do you have any specific resources or videos or anything that can help them develop that? I'm going to just, I saw a tutor do this. There are, I don't know what they're called, but they are these toys that you can buy that are nets basically, and you can make different shapes. So what you can do is if you've got an exam question in front of you, you actually have this toy in your hand, and then you can work out what kind of shape it makes, and then slowly you can take that toy away so that they can visualize making that up physically and what it would look like. So that, I know some tutors for nonverbal reasoning use that. Swagata, can you add to that?
Yeah, sorry, mine's more basic. I've literally just done it with paper and kind of just replicated, you know, so some of the questions where they've got patterns, etc., we'll draw it on. So, okay, fold it up. And now, you know, if you halve it, what would it look like? If you quarter it, what would it look like? And then if you had to rotate it, etc., what would it look like?
Yes.
To get them to understand, you know, the question that's being asked, because actually under pressure, they're actually really difficult questions.
They are really difficult. You know,
Yeah.
I don't even go near maths and nonverbal reasoning because I'm terrible at, especially those sorts of questions. It's just saying she's used paper as well. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, paper, it sprang to mind because I saw this video of this tutor kind of demonstrating using that toy. I don't know what it's called because I don't teach it. And EJ's asked a question that we're going to finish up on. We have run out of time. So Swagata, do you mind if we spill over just a little bit?
No, that's fine. That's fine.
So just a last question then, can you give us a sort of a brief summary of what exam day looks like, please?
Oh gosh, okay. As in from when the child wakes up and preparing them at home, is that what you mean? Or do you mean in terms of the actual kind of...
What should parents expect, I think, you know, so what does the day, in your experience, what does it look like? Are there any top tips that you can give people to make sure that they're ready for the day and calm?
Yeah, so I think what tends to happen is in the lead up to the actual test, 2 days before is when they're going to sit the mock test. And that's when the child, probably for the first time, is sitting in an exam hall, you know, under those sort of exam conditions, really quietly, you know, away from their friends and colleagues, etc. So that is obviously a good way to for them to understand what it will be like on test day. But on the actual day, or what I did with my daughter is completely take the subject away from the 11 plus, knowing full well that they're nervous anyway. So it's about being jolly. For me, it was about I put dance music on in the morning with Alexa for breakfast time in the car, and we talked about everything but the actual exam. And then I just wished her luck on the way into school. But school are pretty good, and they sit it quite early in the morning, pretty soon after they get there. So at least it's done and out of the way. Tips that I can give you is things like I think some schools will probably specify the type of pencil that children can use, but those 2HB ones where it's easy to rub out, if you know, rather than like the really sharp ones where even if you rub it out, the marks are still there. But yeah, just in the lead up to your child going into school, just taking the focus away from the test altogether so that they're distracted, but then just giving them the confidence that actually they can only do their best. They've prepared as much as they can only do their best, and actually it's okay if they don't pass it. They're not a failure. I think those were the sort of key things that I said to my daughter before she went in, and that I think just kind of helped relax her. And then of course she saw her friends in the playground, and you know, that obviously took some of the stress away as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think I'm just going to finish off with one last thing, that we've talked a lot about Swagata's experience, and that's with the Buckinghamshire exams. Now, the Bucks are quite generous with how much information they give. They've got a sample paper, so you know what kind of questions to expect. They do give a lot of support, including the mock exams. Not all schools do that. So if you are with a school or a consortium who don't give you so much support, the best advice I can give you is to pay attention, obviously, to the exam board. But if there isn't an exam board, then try different styles, because the main thing is that they need to be able to apply the skills. When I teach, what I do is, if I give people, for example, a certain style of question, like a multiple choice question, students are so coached and so trained to be able to answer it that the minute I ask the same question in a different way, they struggle. So what you want to do is, rather than getting them thinking almost like a robot, you want to get them mastering those skills. And there's a really big difference. And that's why the books, the flashcards, talking about vocabulary in the car, all of those are really important, because you're able to apply the skills. If you think about what we remember things that we have practiced, not just things we've read in a book, and it's the same for children. So I think trying to embed it into everyday life, the learning into everyday life, is really useful. Now, thank you everyone for the brilliant questions. I think that you've given all of us so much food for thought, and most of all, thank you, Swagata, for giving up your evening and speaking so honestly about your experience. I'm sure it's been really helpful. Thank you again, everyone. You're welcome, Mark. Thank you again, everyone. We're going to leave it here for today. See you soon.
Thanks very much.